So, welcome everyone to this League of Women Voters of West Virginia briefing on the Federal Judiciary Study. And just as a little bit of background, during the 2024 National League Convention, delegates voted to conduct a one-year study on the federal judiciary to arrive at an official league position. And this is an effort that is ongoing, and the process will yield a new position by June of 2025. And so we are hosting this meeting to brief League of Women Voters of West Virginia members on the federal judiciary study process in advance of consensus meetings that we will be holding later this year. We have a state consensus meeting scheduled for March 15th, and local leagues will also be holding their own consensus meetings. But to kind of get us up to speed on where things are with the process, we have our state vice president and president of the Morgantown Monongalia League, Judy Ball, is actually a member of the National Study Committee. So we're very proud and excited that Judy is representing us in the effort. And I'm gonna turn it over to Judy to get things started.
Thank you.
Take it away, Judy.
Thank you. So you all probably know that the two major functions of the League of Women Voters is education and advocacy. And education is sort of self-explanatory. We do a lot of voter education, try to get people to vote, try to tell people why they ought to vote. But advocacy is also important for us. And the League goes at advocacy in a very structured way. So in order to advocate for any piece of legislation, we have to have a position, a foundation for that advocacy. And the National League has a whole book full of positions that have been developed over the decades. Some of these positions are literally decades old. And the document that got sent out to you before this meeting has a link to the most up-to-date version of that document. It's called Impact on Issues 2024 to 2026. The positions that we have in place are basically of two flavors. We have positions that relate to policies. And those are things like voting rights and reproductive rights and climate change, among many others. And then we have positions that deal with institutions. And for the federal government, the two institutions that we currently have positions on are the Congress and the presidency. And if you see there's a hole there, that's because there is. We have no position on the federal courts or on the Supreme Court. And given the growing public dissatisfaction with the courts, especially the Supreme Court, and lots of reform proposals out there being discussed in Congress and elsewhere, the League is sort of in a difficult position because without a position on the federal courts, we can't participate in those reform discussions. And once upon a time, I'm going to give you a little bit of history. In 1965, the League of Women Voters found itself in a similar position. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was being debated in Congress. And the civil rights movement had been going on for at least since the 1950s. But in 1965, the League of Women Voters still didn't have a position on voting rights. So Voting Rights Act of 1965 is coming up and being debated in Congress. And the League of Women Voters of the United States had to be silent, couldn't participate in that debate. There were some state leagues that have voting rights positions and they participated, but the National League couldn't. And to my great surprise, the National League is actually transparent about this and how it recovered from this, what I perceive as a real embarrassment. So here we are again. Federal courts, the Supreme Court in particular, big topic of controversy. The National League has no position. And there are two ways to adopt a position. One is through a study, the other is through concurrence. And because the federal courts are all federal, there are no positions from states or local leagues to adopt by concurrence. So the only way to do a position on the federal courts is to invent the wheel, to do it from scratch. And so, as Julie said, back in June of 2024, the National Convention voted overwhelmingly to conduct this study, and unlike many studies in the past, to do it in 1 year. Studies in the past have often dragged on for 2 years, 3 years. They can take a long time. This time, the delegates said, we want you to do it in a year because this is so important. And we want you to figure out how it can be done in a year. So that's what we've been doing. In order to develop a position, we go through a series of steps. Some of these steps have been shortened thanks to the internet because we can get a lot of information now from our desktops that we used to have to go to libraries to get. We used to have to have in-person meetings to discuss. All of that has now been digitized, if you will. So that is helping us move this forward more quickly than studies in the past. So first we have a study committee, and the study committee was selected from league members from all over the country who applied to participate. We have members of the study committee from California and Texas and Florida and Michigan and West Virginia. And I'm really proud to be representing West Virginia because I think we have a different point of view than some of these folks from some of these bigger states. The other point of view that I bring is, although I have a lifelong interest in the Supreme Court, I'm not a lawyer. So we have some lawyers, we have some non-lawyers. So that's important. So if you have the document that was sent out, there's a graphic on here that shows the study committee, and all of our meetings have been by Zoom. That not just saves time, it also saves money, because in the past, studies have been expensive to conduct because you have to travel and meet, and travel is expensive. We don't have to do that now. After the study committee produces its materials, then the process gets turned over to state and local leagues for consensus meetings. The way positions are adopted is by consensus, not by a vote. This is not, it's funny, this is not a democratic process. It's done by consensus. So every league that chooses to participate will use the same set of consensus questions. And then the results of those consensus meetings will be submitted to the National League. The data will be collated. It'll all be gone through, and we will try from all of that. Don't forget, there are as many as 700 plus state and local leagues across the country. We will take data from however many choose to participate and see if we have a consensus that we can write a position that can then be adopted in June of 2025. And June 2025 is the key date. That's when the National Council meets, convention 1 year, council the next, offsetting years. But before the position even goes to council, it will go to the national board. So leagues across the country have been asked to schedule consensus meetings between February 8th and April 14th. And none of us here in West Virginia have scheduled consensus meetings for early in February because it seemed risky, and I think it's turned out to be the case. Sorry, my little dog is barking at the Great Danes next door. So the local leagues in West Virginia, Jefferson County, Morgantown, Monongalia County, and Huntington are all planning consensus meetings now. And not all of the details of the planning have been worked out. And at least as far as I know to date, all of the local league consensus meetings will be held in person. The one that will be statewide, that will include all of the members who are not in those local leagues, that will be on March 15th, and it'll be on Zoom. It is simply not practical to have members at large, especially from all corners of West Virginia, travel to any central location for a one-day meeting. It just isn't reasonable. So that'll be done on Zoom. But members at large, and I'm really sorry to see, I don't think we have any members at large who are here tonight. I hope, oh, Julie, you're a member at large, and Teresa, you're a member at large. Anybody else? Okay, members at large have an option. You can attend the Zoom and participate in a consensus meeting that way. Or if you happen to be located in a place that is near to one of the local leagues, you're also invited to attend their in-person consensus meetings. And we'll be sending out more details about when and where those meetings will be held. Morgantown is having their meeting on March 29th. Jefferson County is having their meeting on March 29th, and Huntington hasn't decided yet. My guess is it's probably going to be late March by the time it gets scheduled. Now, before I turn this over for questions, I want to remind you that one of the things that the study committee, the National Study Committee, has done is we've tried to make it easy for folks out in the world to get access to information that is valuable to get ready for these consensus meetings. It is, having been through this process with the study committee, it is neither reasonable nor practical to ask you to do all the work that we've done. So we've done a lot of research behind the scenes, and then we've written up a bunch of policy briefs. We've written up a glossary of terms that come up, because a lot of this legal stuff is sort of technical, but we try to put it in lay language, all of it. So all of those materials are available on a single website that the League of Women Voters has made available. And the document that got sent out has the link to that website. There's also a platform that the National League manages called Groups.io. And I know that name doesn't mean anything to anybody. It doesn't mean anything to me either. But just think of it, it's a platform that the National League uses for information sharing. And what it's being used for in this process is league members from all over the country go there, they subscribe to Groups.io, and then that's the place that they can go and ask questions and get answers to their questions. And that's so that everybody gets access to those questions and answers without sending, 10,000 email threads. And the link to the Groups.io platform is also in your document. The National League has a newsletter that comes out about once every 2 weeks. And It also has information updating about the judiciary study. And I bring this to your attention specifically because this newsletter is not just for this study, it's for all sorts of good stuff that's going on in the league. If you want to know more about Chapter Spot, that's a good place to find out about it. And I was a member of the league for years before I knew this newsletter existed. So my advice is, now that you have a link for to subscribe to the newsletter, I recommend that you do so. And finally, the website that I talked about earlier has information that's very specific for planning and conducting the consensus meetings. There's a study guide that goes through all the steps. The consensus questions, there's a PDF version of the consensus questions already there. I think there are 12 of them. And how the answers will be structured. And then in order to kick off each of the consensus meetings, we put together a set of discussion prompts, not to be confused with consensus questions. And these discussion prompts, they are questions, but they're things to help league members sort of think through many of the issues that come up across many of the issues that come up in the policy briefs. So all of these things sort of tie together. And we recommend that you look at them. The discussion prompts, in fact, could be reviewed by local leagues before the consensus meeting. And I sort of recommend that you do so. So that's the other thing. Before I open this up for questions, the other thing that I want to remind you is that if you have questions, yes, you can subscribe to Groups.io and you can put your questions there and you'll get answers to them. Or because I'm right in the middle of all this, you are welcome to send me an email or call me up, but send me an email is probably a better way to get in touch with me and ask your question. And I'm happy to answer it and try to sort of demystify this process. In all the other meetings I have been involved in, a minority of league members have gone through this study process before. And that makes sense because on the national level, I think it's been 10 years since the last major study was done. West Virginia has done studies more recently, but many of you are new and you may not have been, even if you were around, you may or may not have been involved in those studies. So yeah, the other way, Julie, the other email that's useful for contacting me is lwvmorgantown@gmail.com. If you use my AOL, you have a chance of getting buried. Okay, I want to open this up for questions. Any question, don't think of any question as being not relevant, because I know this process it's confusing. And we're all sort of learning this as we go along because most of us haven't been through the process before. So I am happy to answer any and all of your questions. We have time.
Can you talk a little more about what consensus is and how you get to consensus?
Yes, consensus is actually defined in the study guide. Consensus doesn't mean that everybody agrees. It means the general sense of the room. And it doesn't mean a vote, although sometimes a vote may be useful in order to get to that general sense of the room. But it really is that after discussion, you start with the question and you discuss it, you hear different points of view, and then you get a sense of the room, how people fall on this question. We tried really hard in putting together the consensus questions to make them open-ended to make them unbiased, and to include questions that would challenge people to think differently. So you may not reach consensus on all of them. That's fine. But as I said, the study guide goes through the consensus process. One of the other parts of conducting a consensus meeting is you have a recorder, and there's a leader sort of keeps the group on time and leads them through the process. But you also have a recorder, and the recorder takes down the major points that come up during the discussion, and make sure by the time you get to the end of any particular question that consensus has or has not been reached, and then checks back with the group and says, now here's what I heard, here's what I've written down. Is this an accurate portrayal of what you just said? Anybody else? Naoka?
Okay. Hi, Judy, and thank you so much for all the work you've done on this. I noticed that the consensus questions, there were 6 pages that came, and the way it was formatted was, do you agree? Do you somewhat agree? Do you disagree? And I also noticed that one person is supposed to be kind of in control of the counting and reporting. And it also said that you don't accept the paper. So, and like copies of papers, like people can't just check it off and then mail their papers in. And so, like, as you said, there must be a recorder. And so if we're doing this in a specific meeting and people are, some of these questions may be ambiguous to some people in a meeting. It might not be clarified, and that would be a reason for using the study guide and following the questions. But do you think it would be okay to have paper handouts in our meetings that instead of people raising their hands, or because that's the part of the process that I want to see clarified is the counting, because on the paper, like if we did it in a meeting and we give the handouts and the people can check them off, then we can go back and actually count them. If we're doing it by hands, that's something else. It's going to be more time consuming, and some people may be confused and have to ask questions and get clarification, and then maybe hold up their hand, or maybe they didn't hold their hand up at all. So is there a problem with using paper to collect during a meeting and then taking them back? I mean, people don't have to put their names on them.
Okay. You said something that's sort of a red flag for me. Let me explain why.
Okay.
When you talk about counting, to me, that sounds like taking a vote. And you're not taking a vote. That's exactly what you're not doing. That's why, one, we tried to limit the number of consensus questions. So there are only, I think there are 12. And the way to conduct the discussion during the consensus meeting is to give everybody a voice and try to see if the sense of the room is agreement, disagreement, and the temperature of the agreement or disagreement. You know, if there's a question that you're your members who are participating in consensus meeting are just absolutely adamantly opposed, then there's a way to record that. There's also a place in the consensus form that'll come back that there's a place for some comments to be added. And you should take advantage of that. But one of the reasons that that option has been somewhat limited is we don't know how many leagues are going to respond. And we have to have the ability to pull data together from 300, 400, 700 leagues across the country. And so it had to be put together in a way that the data could be relatively easily collated into a form that can then result in a conclusion about whether or not there was consensus or not. Which is not to say that the comments that you provide won't be read. They'll all be read.
So during our actual meeting, so we give people an opportunity to read the questions, and they can be discussed, questions can be asked.
Yes.
And then we would just record how many people agree, how many people no. Okay, now that's what I want to know. Because we can't mail them in, we can't email them in, and we're just reporting to one person who's going to be turning in the answers or the responses that we are getting. And if it's not if people aren't holding up their hands and we aren't counting like that, how are we actually doing it?
So you're not taking a vote.
Well, it's not a vote. It's just like you have agree to disagree. I don't agree. That's not a vote. It's just a count. And what is the
if you're counting opinions, it sounds to me like a vote.
okay?
What you're trying to achieve is the sense of your members. A poll of the Likert scale options. Yeah, that's going to be clear to most people. We talked about many different ways of structuring the responses. And should we have a 5-point scale? Should we have a 10-point scale? Should we have other ways of scaling results? And tried to come up with something that was relatively simple and straightforward that could be then transferred to the National League and could be done. Carlene, you had something to add.
Yeah, sorry.
Don't be sorry.
I've done studies before in League. And so what you try to do when you're running the study at the local level is you try to get everybody to express opinions and sometimes to disagree with each other and to try and talk it out and then see if the group kind of comes together on some sort of a midway. So what she called it before was reading the room. You're looking for people to express what they think, to disagree, and hopefully to find a medium point where they can all be comfortable.
I participated in a league study when I was in Oregon. Had to do with having a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution, which some people think is a great idea. And I remember the kinds of discussions we had of all the pros and the cons and the costs and the benefits. And yeah, the Constitution needs to be amended. And it's so hard to amend. Don't we need something that'll sort of shake things up? But then there was the other side, which was if you have a convention, it's going to open the whole thing up and you could lose all the good stuff we have in the process. And it took a long time, frankly, but we eventually, through the process that Carlene has just described, we talked it through. And over the course of the discussion, we sort of came together on this idea that this really wasn't the way that we wanted to recommend that the Constitution be amended, because the costs just outweighed the benefits. But it was exactly what Carlene said. It was, everybody expressed their opinion. There wasn't, in the beginning, there wasn't a lot of agreement, but by the end, we had come together to a conclusion that we were all satisfied with, or most of us were satisfied with. It doesn't mean that everybody has to agree. Consensus does not mean everybody has to agree, but there's a way in the form, I believe, to record that as well. And the way the results of your consensus discussions get reported, there's going to be a digital form that the data gets submitted. In this day and age, there just isn't any other way. Lynn. You're still on mute.
Okay.
There you go.
So when the 200, 300, 700 leagues have their meetings, can you talk a little bit about what happens next?
Yep. The recorder for each of the leagues that participates, that conducts a consensus meeting, having sat through the meeting, having confirmed with the participants in the meeting that what he or she has written down is an accurate reflection of the sense of the room, that person will be responsible for signing into a league website and entering the results of the consensus meeting. I think that will include the number of people who were involved. It'll identify which league you are. And it'll be the which flavor of consensus or non-consensus you reached, and any comments that are going to be passed along. And as I said, the comments are going to be limited in, I think it's in characters or words. The box is limited in size because we just can't deal with 700 leagues sending us an essay.
And then what happens? How does it go from what it's given you from the local leagues to a position?
Okay. The National League, there are three components of the national, at the national level. We've got the study committee, we've got a contractor who used to be a National League staffer, and we've got league staff. And I think all three components are going to be involved in reviewing what we get. And then let's assume that there's going to be consensus on at least some of the questions. See, there doesn't have to be consensus on all the questions. We'll take the questions on which there was consensus, and from that we'll develop a position. And don't forget, positions are designed to be, my favorite term for a position is durable. And durable means that a position that is adopted in 2025 has to be useful in 2035 and 2045. We have some positions that have been around for that long or longer. And so the position will be written likely in terms of principles. And some of the consensus questions you've seen focus on some of the principles that we included in the scope of the study, because getting consensus on which are the principles that you think are most important is really essential. So we'll go through all of the questions and all of the responses and see which ones we have consensus on, and we'll take the results on all of that and try to meld it into a position. Positions not only are based on principles, they also tend to be very brief, because again, you want them to be durable. And if a position gets to be too specific, it probably isn't going to be very useful for very long. So positions on the Supreme Court, for example, it isn't going to focus on, do we want to overturn the Dobbs decision? Well, we don't need that because we got a position on reproductive rights already. That's not a Supreme Court issue. The Supreme Court issue may be, and I'm just making this up, may be partisanship on the court. It may be preserving judicial independence. It's the principles that the league can then apply to advocacy later on.
Well, does the recommendation of the committee then go to the national board?
Yeah.
And then they vote on it?
Yeah.
And then it becomes a position?
Yeah, which gets presented at council in June.
Ah, okay, so June is the
culmination. Yeah, that's our literally our drop dead date.
Don't leave town, Judy.
Other questions? I don't know. Will the formulated consensus be sent back to the local committees for review prior to the final? I don't think so. This process, this is a sort of tried and true process that we're following here. And there have been opportunities along the way for state and local leagues to weigh in. There was a kickoff webinar that started out the process, and that webinar had something like 650 people attended it. It was amazing. There was a town hall that just was done a week or so ago that we brought in some experts to talk about.
That was very good.
Court issues. We've gotten a lot of good feedback on it. And the kickoff webinar and the town hall, the recordings of those are both on the website that I've given you the link to. So you can go and watch them if you want. They're about an hour. And the kickoff was useful, especially because there were a lot of questions. And I don't remember the exact number, but I think only about half of the people who participated had ever been involved in a study before. And when I've done briefings for the local leagues around West Virginia, we also have that same experience that not many people have gone through this process before. And so that's why the study guide was so absolutely important. And I worked on the study guide with my colleague in California, because getting that study guide to go through all the steps and to be clear about the whys and wherefores for each step was really important. So you should pay a lot of attention to the study guide if you have not been through this process before. It's written in plain English. It's not anything fabulous in terms of being highly technical, but it goes through the entire process so that everybody can understand what they're participating in.
Thank you.
More questions? Yeah, things like the study guide and the consensus questions are already there. The we have tried to be as prompt and transparent as possible throughout this process. That's why all of these documents are there. I mean, the study guide, I'm sure under some circumstances, the study guide would have only been released to leaders on the state and local leagues who were going to be leading the consensus meetings. That's not the case. All the information is there for every league member to look at. Julie's putting up links for the town hall and the kickoff webinar in the chat so that you can look. But if you just go to the website that is in the document that got sent out to you today, you go to that website and you just scroll down, all of the material is listed there. In the typical fashion for the league's website. It may not be easy to find, but it's all there. Other questions? Lindell,
Has a question.
you're
Lindell,
on
you're
mute,
muted.
Lindell.
Okay, am I,
Okay.
can you,
You're good.
yeah, in the town hall, there was a lot of discussion about the shadow docket, but there's nothing in that addresses that particularly in the consensus questions, but I think it's very interesting, and I didn't know whether that would be part of the,
There's a policy brief on the shadow docket that
right,
I helped work on. If you think about the consequences of the shadow docket is, for those of you who aren't yet familiar with it, is the Supreme Court. Most of the cases that we're familiar with are the regular docket that go through the court, and they come, the cases make their way up from the lower courts to the Supreme Court through the natural process, and then the cases, the briefs are all submitted and they're put out on a website. The dockets are all there, all of the briefing materials, and then the lawyers come and they present their cases before the justices, and the justices question them, and then they go away and they decide among themselves in secret how they're going to vote, and they write their rulings, and eventually, oftentimes not until June, which is when the Supreme Court term ends, they oftentimes don't release those findings until June, at the end of the session. And the more controversial the case, the more likely it's going to hang loose until June. Okay, so that's the regular docket. The shadow docket is the regular docket is the number of cases that go through that process are something like, I don't know, 60, 70 a year. That's not the case for the shadow docket. It's much bigger, and it's all sort of behind the curtain. The shadow docket incorporates things like pleas for certiorari that get denied. It includes cases for people who are pleading for executions to be halted. But it also increasingly has included cases that previously would probably have come onto the normal docket through the normal processes. The problem is those cases arrive at the Supreme Court's door without having gone through the normal process. So they may come without the full set of legal proceedings that we would normally see. They may come without any sort of open briefing. And the court may release their findings on those cases with no votes disclosed and without any written ruling. They just say whether it's accepted or denied. So the shadow docket has become bigger and bigger and bigger, and more of a sort of denial of transparency. That's how it's been criticized. There are many features of the Supreme Court that sort of feed into whether or not the shadow docket is a good thing or a bad thing. And there are consensus questions having to do with transparency and having to do with openness and what needs to be publicly disclosed. So the shadow docket relates to those, even if it's not named.
Okay.
But read the policy.
So there are
brief,
two
the shadow
questions.
docket. It's really interesting. And Steve Vladeck, he's a professor at University of Texas Law School, I think. He wrote a book about the shadow docket. He is widely regarded as the absolute expert in this area. And I just discovered over the weekend, he has a Substack column that he writes, I think, weekly. So I recommend you follow him.
So that would be the consensus questions about transparency and about court hearings should be open and available to the public. Both of those, we can bring that up as part of the discussion.
Yeah, you could certainly bring those up. Yeah. I mean, there are so many places that if you read the policy briefs, there's so many places that transparency comes up and openness comes up. And I mean, just things as simple as if you want to know what the Supreme Court is doing, you can go stand in line in order to get a seat in Washington. But the seats are very limited. And the Supreme Court does not televise, they don't live stream their proceedings. And during the COVID pandemic, they live streamed the oral arguments. They don't do that all the time anymore. So it's this openness of our court to the public is a real problem for some of us. Lindell, by the way, for Morgantown is one of the people who has been through this process before. And we are depending on her expertise because I haven't been through the whole thing before.
Who did you say is the author of that column and the book?
Steve Vladeck, V as in Victor, Ladeck.
Okay.
And his name is probably in a footnote on the policy brief having to do with the shadow docket. That's the other thing. It's some folks have asked about sources. Why didn't you give us a giant bibliography? Well, do you really want a giant bibliography? But one of the things I made sure to do as we were developing the policy briefs, because I sort of took it on my, I'm a compulsive editor. And one of the things I did was made sure that most of the policy briefs have footnotes for some really important chunks. And so those footnotes have links to the original documents. If you want to go read them, go to it. The President's Commission on the Reform of the Supreme Court, that they released their report in 2021, I think. It was a bipartisan commission. It may have been put together by Biden, but it was a bipartisan commission and brought together constitutional lawyers from across the country. And I wrote the policy brief on that document because it's massive. but there's a link to the document there, so assuming it's still up on the website, at the White House. Anyway, it's there for your enjoyment. Other questions? We added time to this so that we would make sure that we wouldn't run out of time and not be able to address all your concerns. So we don't have to use it all, but we have the time if you want to use it. Niobe, you look like you got another question.
Well, I don't know so much if it's a question, but I'm going to paraphrase that we're having a discussion. We're discussing the question, and the people are discussing the question back and forth. And then at the end of the discussion, the person who is reading the question may say, because it's so subjective and it's really reading the room, and whoever is leading this should be very perceptive. Says, well, it seems like from the discussion that there's a consensus that that the majority agrees. Would that be a good kind of a synopsis for the way that would go?
Carlene, I would be comfortable with that. How about you?
Yeah, having trouble, sorry. Yeah, I agree, because I remember when we did it, the questions were not as flexible as we'd like for what the room discussed and how we felt. So we ended up writing comments, saying, yeah, we mostly agree with this, but, and then adding some comments to amend it slightly. So that's how we dealt with that situation.
One of the things that we, when we started out working on the questions, we had taken the 4 principles that had been in the original scope and had sort of glommed them all together in one question. And somebody said, no, you can't do that. What if somebody agrees with one and they don't agree with the other, and they agree with that one over there, and they really disagree with this one? We need to make those separate questions. So they're separate questions. There are four components to the scope. And so there are 4 questions having to do with each of those components. Lindell, did you have something?
Oh, just looking at the first 4 questions, I think, well, these are no-brainers. Of course, everybody's for transparency. Everybody's for accountability. Everybody is for independence. Everybody is for ethics. I mean, why would you not be for any of these things?
Ah, I love that. I love when people point that out. Let me push back a little bit. If you think transparency, yeah, well, who would be opposed to transparency? Well, if you demand more transparency of the courts, aren't you taking away their independence? We've gone 100 and 200, however many 100 years the United States has been around with the Supreme Court, with the court being responsible for the conduct of its own business. We've trusted them, if you will. We don't trust them anymore so much. And that's not my opinion. The data, the polls show that. The current approval rating for the Supreme Court is probably as low as it's ever been. It's certainly as low as it's been since Gallup has been collecting data on it. So transparency is great. There have to be limits to transparency because of confidentiality issues. But then how do you balance transparency and independence? Because you also want probably a court that is independent. We've always had a court that was independent for most of its life. We valued the independence of the court. That's how the courts can push back against the other two branches of government, is because they're independent. That's the essence of separation of powers. So that's why those questions are in there as they are. And we hope that there will be people in your groups who will think about these trade-offs, if you will. And that's part of the purpose of the discussion prompts. This discussion prompts are many, many, many more pages of questions. But they were designed to get people thinking about these trade-offs. That it's not just that transparency is good and independence is good, but what about how do these things interact, and how should we be concerned about taking something away? What do we give up if we take something away? So thank you, Lindell. It's almost like I planted that question and I didn't. So that's the other thing about your consensus meetings. Try to avoid having your people just read the questions and say, oh yeah, we like this. Have them think a little more deeply, and use the materials that have been provided to help them think a little more deeply. We don't expect everybody to be lawyers. Some of the most difficult people we have dealt with in this process, by the way, have been lawyers. But think about these things in terms of democracy, in terms of how they affect us in real life, because increasingly what the federal courts do affect us in real life. In fact, the federal courts have been affecting us in real life for a very long time, as some better than others. Do we have other questions? The Brennan said a presentation at the town hall, Cindy? Cindy?
I'm sorry, I'm here. Yes, they gave us so many things to consider in a very thoughtful way. And I did not feel like everybody that came to the presentation was of the same mindset, but they gave us very good insight and thinking points into the constraints and liberties of the courts.
Good point. We tried in that town hall to have experts who could speak to issues with the federal courts. They talk mostly about the Supreme Court, but speak to issues with the federal courts from a very knowledgeable point of view, but to do it in a way that was accessible to lay people. And I think they did a really good job with that. The three people, they didn't do long presentations. They did short presentations and then took questions. And there was actually more agreement than I expected, but in the nuances, there were some disagreements, and those disagreements are important, and that town hall is probably worth listening to just for that reason. Nancy.
I have not read the information. I started it again, but I mean, I'm wondering if someone asked, because when I think of transparency in the law, I think there's an easy, it's easy to say they are transparent. They tell you the facts of the case. They tell you what law they're using. And if there's a dissent, why? I mean, so when somebody may want a definition, what do you mean by transparency? What are you really looking for here? Because if you read their case, we've told you all of this. I mean, I can see where there can be a lot of discussion and things like that.
You raise a good point, and for cases that go up through the normal process, the normal docket, that is absolutely true. There's a lot of transparency. For cases that are dealt with on the shadow docket, that's not the case. And we don't know, for example, how probably the biggest problem with the shadow docket is we don't know how the justices voted. We just know the ruling. And even more importantly, in terms of transparency, it is typical for cases that come through the shadow docket that they do not write up their rationale or how they came to their ruling. And that becomes a problem for subsequent litigants because the law changes and they don't know how it changed or why.
Right. So I guess if someone asks who's the one that's kind of the leader to define transparency, is there anything in the materials that would define transparency?
Yes, there is a document that in the vernacular we have been calling the glossary, and I was shocked when I went to the website and found out that it's no longer called the glossary. It's called terms. And the terms that are used across the policy briefs and the terms that come up again and again in the consensus questions and in all of this discussion about the courts, those terms we pulled out and put into a dictionary so that everybody would be able to sing from the same hymnal. We wanted to be sure that when transparency was, when we were talking about transparency, they were all talking about the same thing. And one of the places we ran into a problem with this was accessibility. I was equating accessibility with transparency early on. And then one of my colleagues, as it turns out, was equating accessibility with everybody has access to the courts as a fairness issue. And that was a completely different take on accessibility than I had. So we clarified that in putting together the glossary actually helped us in laying out exactly what we meant and meaning what we said.
I guess that was, I guess really what I was asking, if someone has a question, you would define it as in the glossary. So we're all doing it.
Yeah, the glossary is called key terms.
Okay, so okay, thanks, Judy.
And it's sort of hidden in the middle of the policy briefs. I don't know why it wasn't separated out. And again, I have a lot of problems with how the league organizes its websites. And this is one of my problems. It's hard to find the key stuff. But key terms is in the list with policy briefs. And if I were you, I would recommend that you take the key terms and you print it out and you have it sort of alongside all the materials as you're reading them. Each of the policy briefs, by the way, every one of them, it deals with a specific topic. But then at the end of every one of them is a list of principles that are relevant to that topic. And we didn't start out putting the policy briefs together like that, but we decided that because the position is ultimately going to have to focus on principles. That if we were talking about policies without highlighting which principles they were related to, that we're really doing our members a disservice. And so every one of those policy briefs has a little section on the bottom with a little box that lists the principles that are related to that policy. And you may agree or disagree with those principles, but there they are. And then those principles are defined in the key terms.
Okay. I just was wondering if everybody was doing the same thing, if there'd be a lot of differences.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be very, yeah, so.
Absolutely. And we wanted to avoid people sort of reinterpreting, having different interpretations of the same term. Thank you for bringing that up. And as I've been talking, Julie has been putting in lists of how you get to all this stuff and explaining it along the way. Anybody else? Betty.
This question is way down the line, but I've been thinking about it since the judiciary idea came up. We have state courts, we have local courts, we have all of this level, municipal courts. Is there any intent that you have heard from anybody to go on to study some of those other things? There are problems all over the country with some of them. It would be very interesting, in my opinion, to go on and study the different levels.
Well, let me go at this in two different ways. One is the reason this study focuses only on the federal courts, and even then only on the Article 3 federal courts. It's important that not all federal courts are included.
Right.
There's the Article 3 courts. The reason this study is so limited is because that's what the delegates at the convention in 2024 said do. But also because you can't do it all in a year.
Oh, yeah. But I'm not talking about doing it in a year. But
the other part is what you're referring to. There could very well be state positions that address some of those other courts, the state and local courts. I know, for example, last spring, I was working with colleagues in Oregon, the League of Women Voters in Oregon. We were putting together a resolution to take to the June convention on ethics. And so in order to see what other leagues had already done on ethics, I did as complete a survey as I could of all the positions on ethics that were in existence and accessible from leagues across the country. And many states have positions on ethics that cover courts. They cover other things as well, but they can cover courts. We ended up borrowing heavily for the resolution that we submitted to the convention in June. We borrowed heavily from a position, an ethics position that had been established by the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, Ohio. And it was notable because unlike many of the other positions on ethics in government that we found, and I found several, I mean, West Virginia even has one, but many of them were oh so detailed and long, and just went down into the weeds. And we now know that the best positions are the ones that are much higher level. I think of the taking on the topic from more of a 30,000 foot level, so that you actually end up with a position that you can use across many different purposes. And so the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland had this fabulous position on ethics in government. We ended up borrowing heavily from it for the resolution that was then adopted at the National Convention in June. I think that the same thing could be true for positions on state courts, that probably going to state leagues and looking at what they have could be a better solution. And then you don't have to do a whole study from the ground up. You can do it by concurrence. And, concurrence is the quick and easy way to do positions. Is you say somebody else has done all the heavy lifting and we're just going to concur with it and make it ours.
Thank you.
Anyone else? We've gotten a lot of questions about why just the Article 3 courts, and does this include the FISA courts? What about the immigration courts and all these things? And probably 80%, 90% of what we're doing is focused on the Supreme Court. The other federal courts they're important, but in the world we live in, they're much less problematic. Julie.
So
We're
can
getting an
you
education
yeah,
these
so can you-
days on the courts, the various courts.
Yeah.
So could you just quickly say like which courts fall under Article 3?
Off the top of my head, no, but it is, it is the second key term in the key terms document.
Okay.
The way I think about it is there are other federal courts, but the main ones that we're covering are the Supreme Court, the Federal Courts of Appeals, there are 13 of them, and all of the federal district courts. Those are the trial courts. There are other miscellaneous other federal courts under Article 3, but those three batches are the really important ones. And those are the ones that are most involved in cases that are going up through the levels in order to get to the Supreme Court. And I think, Julie, there is a graphic document on the website, if you want to put up the link, that lays out how the federal courts are all configured and interrelated. It turned out the Congressional Research Service was really valuable in finding documents that sort of laid these things out in nice, clear language. Did you find it?
I see there's in the preliminary background, there's a understanding federal courts
That's the one.
document.
Yeah. One of the key differences between the Supreme Court and the lower courts, of course, is the ethics rules that apply. That the Supreme Court is it's the Wild West, and the appeals courts and the district courts they're actually controls. Although it is said that they don't do a very good job of controlling themselves. But there are laws. The Supreme Court, on the other hand, says, oh, we'll make it up as we go along. Thank you, Teresa.
Yes, thank you. And if folks want to save the chat, you should be able to save the chat by, let me see. I'm trying to remember how you do that.
Why don't you save it and
I'll
send out a copy to everybody?
Okay, yeah, and I'll
Along
also,
with the document again?
yes, I sent the document out in advance of the meeting, but if you registered late, you may not have received it, so I will resend it, and we'll also work to get this recording up somewhere where we can share that as well. So if you need a recap, or it'll be there, and then it'll also be available to people who were not able to join.
One of the things that the National League was very concerned about, and I'm especially concerned about given the number of our members who are not within local leagues, is making sure that the members at large, the members of the league, the legitimate members of the league, but they're not within any local league, to make sure that the MALs had a chance to participate in this process. And that's why we're making this special arrangement to either attend by Zoom or attend one of the in-person meetings with one of your local leagues, because we really want the MALs to have a voice. And too often I think that people who are in the MAL category, except for Julie and Teresa, of course, feel like they're not part of the league. The exception, of course, being Dr. Joe Golden, who lives in Beckley, and he's an active member of LWVUS and has been from the very beginning. And I'm just thrilled that he has been such an active member of LWVUS, because so often our MALs are sort of hidden. And they're valuable. They're valuable members of the league, and we want them to be included. So I'm good. You have emails for me. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. And as soon as I get final details on the local leagues consensus meetings, those will be coming out in email also. So don't ignore your email and think if it's coming from the League of West Virginia that it's asking for money. That's not why you're getting email from us. Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.